Hello and welcome to Beyond Today, the program that addresses the future of our community through conversations with people who are working today for a better tomorrow. I'm Ray Shermonte, your host for Beyond Today and Assistant Executive Director for the Hillsborough County City-County Planning Commission. In our last program, we talked about fostering a sense of place. We will be talking today with our guest about the U.S. Census, which will be taken in the year 2000. We want to touch on some of the impacts of the census, how it will be taken, and what this all means to our county and planning for our future. Our guest today is Jim Hosler, the Planning Commission's key demographer and Director of Research. Welcome to Beyond Today, Jim.
Thank you, Ray.
One of the questions I think that our audience would be interested in is what exactly does a demographer do and how do you become such a thing?
Well, it's not the type of thing that you graduate from high school wanting to be a demographer. Usually you pick it up in either a sociology department or an economics department or a geography department. I don't think there's any university that has it as a discipline. It's usually a sub-discipline within one of those three. It's been called the dismal science, in that what we are concerned about are the components of population change, which are births, deaths, and migration. We spend a lot of time studying those components and taking a look at the factors that make them change over time.
So definitely that is something that we can see is related to planning, since we're trying to plan for the future.
Certainly, yes it is.
We have kind of, I guess, for planners, an exciting time coming on, and that's the U.S. Census, when all the figures change. I'd like to talk a little bit about the census. What is the primary reason that the census is taken?
Well, there's one primary reason for the census, and that's for reapportionment for elections. From school board districts to congressional districts to the presidency, the census says how many people are in each election district. There's a certain number of people required to be in each congressional district. Of course, there's just 2 senators per state. But there's, like, for example, Hillsborough County, you have 4 equal-sized districts. And each time there's a census taken, we're required to reapportion those districts to make sure that they're all the same size. And that reapportionment is based upon the census. Now, the census does a lot more than that. Over the years, it's grown. Back when it was first started, it asked questions like what type of house you live in. It was very simple, on just a little card. And it's gone to be now where it's a major undertaking that costs about $2–3 billion a year to take.
That's quite a bit of money.
Yes, it is.
Some of the other information, you talked about reapportionment, and that's not something that I really readily thought about as a purpose for the census, but we get a lot of information from the census. What are some of the things that are in the census, and I know there's some changes coming, if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yes, there is. The 1990 census received quite a bit of attention from Congress, and I think it kind of shows the power of the data and the power of the information, and that members of Congress understand that the census can dictate what their district is, the size of it, where it is, and how it's broken up. And there's been a lot of attention on it this last several sessions of Congress. The census is attempting to move to some type of mail-out, mail-back questionnaire where they do a survey instead of counting everybody across the country. I'm not convinced that's going to work because you kind of have to count everybody at least once every 10 years. But all of the information we have on educational attainment, income, occupation, housing units, what the characteristics of those housing units are, poverty level, the whole range of statistics that you read about in the paper every day, they're based upon the census. Now, what's interesting is that there's a lot of companies that make money off of the census between census years because people still need data in years other than those that are decade ending, like 1990 and the year 2000. And those companies make quite a bit of money going in and recalculating those variables in the intercensal years. So in a sense, everything that we have basically dealing with the characteristics of peoples and family come from the census. Even if it's not directly, there's companies that calculate data based upon the census.
That is something that I know occurs on a yearly basis, is kind of re-estimating and tracking what's happening. How is that at the end of the 10 years? I mean, what is the track record for those estimates? Are they fairly close, or are there usually big surprises when the census actually comes out? Well,
it kind of depends on a lot of issues, like how many homeless people you might have in your area. If the census takers had an easy time getting around some of the areas of your city. Some areas in the city, in some large cities, it's not a very friendly place for census takers to go. And strangely enough, those areas don't receive as full account as some areas where it might be a little safer to go. But the information that's collected is again used in the intercensal years. and it's something that we all rely upon.
So it is pretty accurate, or?
Well, it's accurate as a whole. Like as a whole, it might be off. Of course, what do you compare it to? There is no other complete count to compare your census to. Demographers go back and they do surveys to see if they think they had a good count. But we're usually, as a whole, within 1%, but you do find within certain population subgroups that we're off quite a bit. For example, in the 1990 census, for urban African American males between the age of, let's say, 14 and 25, we're about 15 to 17% off of that count. So within certain population subgroups, there is some severe undercounting, but I guess the only response to that is it's the best game in town.
Now, how can you ascertain that it's been undercounted? How do people come to that conclusion?
That's an interesting point, because you have to go out and you have to base it against some type of base figure. And that base figure are detailed surveys that the Census Bureau goes out and does after the census to see if they did a complete count. And they'll actually go out and fan out over a neighborhood and count every single building and every single room to make sure to get a count to compare the census count back to.
So it really does become significant that as accurate a count as possible is taken.
Well, especially when you're looking at, like, for example, City of Tampa City Council districts. If there's an undercounting of, let's say, African Americans in a district, and that district then is made larger because of that, because we're required by law to have one minority African American district within Tampa City Council districts, then it becomes a problem for the election, because you don't get an accurate reflection of what's going on within that district.
Now, what are some of the other issues, I guess, that the census touches upon? I guess income would be one.
Right, income. Migration status, fertility status when you had your last child, how many children are in your household, what type of household you live in, whether or not there's another, like if you're in a housing unit, are there 2 or 3 households in that one housing unit. Basically everything that you can imagine as characteristics of people. Back in the 70s, they were asking about number of musical instruments in the house, which they don't ask anymore, I guess, because of the oversight from Congress. But there's quite a bit of pressure on the census this time around in the year 2000. The billions that it cost the last time to conduct the census, which when you think back about, that's good for 10 years, it might not be that large of a figure, has gotten the attention of Congress, and they're looking to cut back that amount of money. It's budget cutting times everywhere, and apparently the Census Bureau is going to have some trouble this time around.
Now, do you feel, or has a decision been made as exactly what areas are not going to be addressed this time compared to last?
No, it looks like that they're going to cut back pretty severely on the survey or the sample that they do. See, there's the long form that's sent out to everybody. Every household gets the long form. And then there's a 5% sample that's taken of all households. It looks like that they're going to be cutting back quite a bit on the questions included in that sample. But right now that's all up in the air, and they don't know how much money they have yet to conduct the 2000 census, and here we are 2 years away. I remember the 1990 census. There were some pretty serious planning activities that started in 1988, so they need to get a handle on it fairly quickly, which I'm sure they will, because 1998 is just around the corner, and there needs to be some planning started on conducting the census.
Now, I've been under the impression that in fast-growing areas like Florida or Hillsborough County, that we're somewhat at a disadvantage with the census information not being kept up to date that can affect us getting federal monies for certain projects. Is that correct, that fast-growing states are at a disadvantage? Yes,
fast-growing states are at a disadvantage because the Census Bureau has to base their mail-out on something, and they base their mail-out on postal addresses and on what the U.S. Post Office has. And if an area has a lot of turnover, a lot of change in addresses, that's going to mean that area does not have as accurate a count as, let's say, an area that is very stable and hasn't had that much population change. So it is very important for cities like Tampa that are growing rapidly to understand that the census is not something to be afraid of. It's not a threat. Everything that's included in there is totally anonymous. There is no name tied to it, and it's only collected just for information purposes. In fact, it's against federal law for anybody with the census to reveal the identity of anybody that fills out a census form.
I would think that, I guess, some of the general mistrust of government at times probably interferes with people answering the census. And now they'll actually be taking the census when?
April 1st, the year 2000.
And then the information from that census, what is the time lag before that can be used?
There is, in 1990 it was kind of interesting. There was one count that came out of the census, and then there was a corrected account, that, like what we talked about earlier, where they went back, they did some surveys and saw where there was some undercounting. But they're required to have that out in time for the redistricting that's going to go on for the election. So it has to come out fairly quick. But the sample data, there will be data rolling out in 2002, 2003. What they're trying to do with the census also is not put out as much printed material as they have in the past. I don't know if you've seen census volumes in our library, but the one for Hillsborough County is about like this when they're all stacked together. And they're trying to do as much as they can on CD-ROM and on the internet, so they don't have to produce as much paper as they did in the past. And also they don't have to wait in the government printing office to print the documents.
Now, a lot of the documentation from the census is based on something called a census tract. Can you tell us what that is?
Census tracts were developed back in about I think it was 1940s to pull together areas of similar characteristics within cities so we can analyze how cities change over time. And they're supposed to be areas of similar population size. Now, over time, for example, there were census tracts that were drawn in the central city of Tampa that had X number of people when it was formed back in 1940, and some of those census tracts don't have that number of people in it now, but they've left it the same. What you find in some rapidly growing areas, like out in the, let's say, northwest Hillsborough, you'll have a census tract that's been divided 4 or 5 times since 1940, 1950, because it's been growing, and they've been trying to keep the same number of people in that, in the census tract. Basically what it is, it's a small area of analysis that they produce a lot of data for that you can use to do studies with.
Now, is it likely that we'll be changing some of those boundaries as part of this 2000
Yes.
census?
That's one thing we're doing right now in the Planning Commission is we basically run a committee that comes up with what the various designated places are and what the census tracts are. We're starting to gear that up now. We're going to include everybody from all the jurisdictions and people from TICO and people from the post office and whoever needs to be included that's going to use the data. And we'll come up with the census designated places and the boundaries for those. And the Census Bureau will probably do most of the looking at whether or not census tracts need to be changed because they have to be of equal size. But we'll have some involvement in reviewing what those census tract lines are.
So there's really a lot of front-end work that's going on now really to prepare for this census. When we return, we'll talk some more about various aspects of the U.S. Census.
The principles of good neighborhoods. Citizens and policymakers are reconsidering the way in which cities, neighborhoods, and transportation systems are built. Current regulations tend to reinforce a pattern of development that is dominated by the automobile. Economic and lifestyle changes suggest the need for a choice of neighborhood patterns that might improve the quality of life of your community. Some of these neighborhood patterns are: the neighborhood pattern, layout, and design emphasize human scale. The design of streets should be livable, encouraging slow traffic, walking, and bicycling. Neighborliness and communication are facilitated by a balance between public space and private space, by creating places to meet, and by designing the street as a public living room. Each neighborhood should have its own identity and character. Learn more about the principles of good neighborhoods. The Principles for Good Neighborhoods booklet is available at the Planning Commission Library on the 18th floor of the County Center. Many of its design concepts have been adopted in a design component of the Hillsborough County Comprehensive Plan. The plan is available at your local library or call the Planning Commission at 272-5940. Also, check the Planning Commission's internet homepage.
Welcome back to Beyond Today. I'm your host, Ray Shermonte, and we've been discussing the impact of the U.S. Census and what we can expect when the county begins in 2000. I'm here again with Jim Hosler, who heads up the Planning Commission's research staff. Jim, what I'd like to talk about now is something, I guess, more local. Let's talk about Tampa and Hillsborough County and what's happening here. Tell us about the county's growth rate. How are we growing differently than we did, say, in the 70s and 80s when it appeared to me we were growing faster? What's going on?
Right. We back in the 70s and the early to mid 80s, we were growing probably about 3 to 4% per year, which is probably growth rate that we could not sustain just because it's hard to provide public services for that amount of growth within a county this size. We had a real slowdown in growth in the late 80s and the early 90s. 1991, we really only grew less than 1%. It was about 0.6%. But the last couple of years it's picked up a little bit, and we're at between about 1.5% and 2% per year in growth, which translates to about 15,000 to 18,000 people per year net added to Hillsborough County. Now what's important to remember, especially Hillsborough County, is that's not all people moving in. About half of our growth in any one year is excess of births over deaths, which is called natural increase. And about the other half is due to net in-migration.
Now, Hillsborough and Pinellas County are somewhat different in that sense. How the birth rate probably wouldn't be that major issue in Pinellas County.
Correct. There are lots of people in Pinellas County having children and raising children. However, with the large number of elderly folks in Pinellas County, they do have a very high death rate. So their natural increase isn't near what it is in Hillsborough County. And as a consequence, they don't grow as fast as we do.
Now, we're part of what's called Metropolitan Statistical Area, I believe, and
yes.
That includes which counties that are considered together in that? In
the Tampa, St. Pete, Clearwater metropolitan area is Hernando County, Pasco County, Pinellas, and Hillsborough. And basically these counties are, and these areas are artifacts of government, primarily the Office of Planning and Budgeting at the federal level, and they're used to basically hand out federal money. Metropolitan areas are eligible for federal funding that other areas are not eligible for, and it's used to designate funds within those categories.
Now, some people might wonder why it's those particular 4 counties and another metropolitan area, such as Miami, is just Dade County but doesn't include other counties. How is all that decided?
That has gotten a lot more complicated over the years. It really has. They started forming metropolitan areas back in the 50s and 60s. But each metropolitan area has a central city. Ours has 3, Tampa, St. Pete, and Clearwater. And what's looked for is actually physical and financial signs of connections between the various counties that form a metropolitan area. For example, there has to be X percentage of commuters that live in one county and work in the central city county. There's actually a measurement of bank deposits to see if a banks within the central city hold the majority of the deposits or a large percentage of the deposits for the people within that area. So there's some very specific criteria that go into that, but the smallest unit of aggregation that can go into it is a county. So ours is the 4 counties.
Well, we talked a little bit about growth in the 80s, and it appears that we're really tracking what's going on at a national level. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the effects of things that happened in the past on present growth rates. Can you explain a little bit why things are picking up now and why they were slower in the late 80s?
Sure. Well, there was some things going on and especially in the early 1990s. There was the Gulf War, and there was interest rates had gone up quite a bit. And anytime there's anything unsettling like that or there's uncertainty involved, people slow down moving. They don't make the decision to move, at least on an aggregate. So there's things like that kind of operate over top of some underlying characteristics that really drive population growth. And of course what we're in now is, you and I, Ray, we're baby boomers. We were born between 1945 and 1964, which is when the baby boom is traditionally thought of as being. And a number of factors resulted in there being an incredibly huge number of children born during that period of time. Now we're all reaching our peak earning years, at least supposedly we're all reaching our peak earning years. And we've settled down some, but we've gotten to the point now, our generation delayed childbearing perhaps more than any other generation has in history, primarily because we had the means to do it. But childbearing has been delayed, but people are now having the 1 and 2 children that they delayed having, so that's growing. That's why schools are so crowded now. That's why elementary schools are so crowded, and it's going to be junior high schools and high schools down the road because our children are moving through the system.
Now, if you kind of project that in the future, what I would think would occur, since the schools are crowded now, you would look for an increased formation of households coming in 5 to 10 years, which of course is going to put pressure on our infrastructure, provide opportunities obviously for people to build homes. Is that an accurate analysis of what's occurring?
Yes, it is. And when they start forming households, you got to kind of think about how they're going to form them. Are they going to form them the same way we did? Are they going to delay getting married like we did, as a generation at least? Or are they going to delay having children like we did as a generation? You don't know. It could be the opposite effect, where maybe they decide to just take on things differently. But they're going to be a very large generation, our children. They're going to be a very educated generation. They're going to be a generation with some pretty high expectations on what their lifestyle is going to be, which I think is going to fuel a very healthy economy, everything else being equal, down the road 2010, 2015.
So things look a little bit positive for the foreseeable future from a demographic sense.
Right, but what we're into now is the especially since we're primarily a retirement state. Our children and us, we're kind of stable, and we're the large age group within the age structure right now. Those two age groups that move to Florida typically are working age folks and retirees, and as it happens, both those age groups nationwide now are somewhat small. If we look at folks in the working age, they're the folks that were born after the baby boom, and there's just not that many in that age in that age group. If we look at retirees, they're folks that were born during the Great Depression, 1930s. Birth rates were very low then. So what we're looking at is a period probably between now and about 2005, 2010, where there's going to be just not that many folks at risk, as we say, to move to Florida, as there had been in the past. So growth rates will probably stay fairly moderate for the next 5 to 7 years. But after that, if we can keep ourselves a nice place to live, and if we can maintain a good reputation, and there's not a change in preferences among people, we should be doing quite well.
Jim, I'd also like to talk a little bit about how does business use the census information to make decisions?
One of the biggest things I think that came out of the 80s was target marketing and called niche marketing, where businesses would identify specific segments of the population, like middle-aged males from a certain part of the country might have certain purchasing habits, and they would have to be identified. You have to find out where they live, what their addresses are. And the census could help with that, because it can pinpoint where there's concentrations of folks you might be looking for if you're a niche marketer. So target marketing and niche marketing really took off in the 80s and 90s. There's magazines out there that just deal with that. There's companies that will help you identify the niches that you're after. But it's all based upon the basic census data that's collected every 10 years, and businesses depend on that quite a bit.
Now, how does Tampa and Hillsborough County compare with other parts of the country as far as statistics?
We seem to be more or less a model of how the state grows, at least. If you take a look at the state's characteristics, as far as age structure, as far as how rapidly the state grows, we pretty much mirror that. And we also pretty much mirror what's going on nationwide. It's kind of an interesting thing. There's a lot of diversity in Hillsborough County. There's a lot of different ethnic groups, racial groups, age groups, but it makes for a very nice mix that pretty much matches what's going on nationwide and in Florida.
So really, Hillsborough County's characteristics aren't that different than the country as a whole.
No, we're an unusual county for Florida, and that we're not that old, and there's a large working segment of the population. But yes, we do pretty much match what's going on nationwide.
I think that's interesting that you said we're not typical for Florida, because I sense that there's a difference in the people of Hillsborough County compared to Pinellas, Pasco, Hernando. What are some of the differences you see between those counties and Hillsborough County?
Well, it's primarily, I think, what drives our local economy and what attracts people to the area. We've never really been that large of a retirement area. We have Sun City Center down in South Hillsborough County that does an excellent job of attracting retirees, but that's really our only large retirement village down there. And we're primarily a working community, tied to the port, tied to the airport, tied to transportation, tied to a lot of things that fuel the economy nationwide, so we tend to have the same characteristics as the nation as a whole.
Now, my sense also is that Hillsborough County might be a little bit more stable. Is there a larger percentage of native-born Floridians in Hillsborough County than some of the surrounding counties?
Right. Hillsborough County, when you think about it, is really one of the few counties in the state that has a long history. There was Cuban and Italian immigrants moved here in the past. That they gave us a diversity, they gave us a richness that you don't find in a lot of the other metropolitan areas in Florida. We are a real city that's been here for a while, that has real city characteristics, which is unusual for the state.
Well, that seems, since we're somewhat unique in those areas, those are the areas we might want to concentrate on as our history as far as marketing ourselves, because my impression visiting many other parts of Florida is that Hillsborough County is somewhat unique in that it has a long history. What demographic changes do you see coming to Hillsborough County in the future? Where are we going as far as our mix? And
we had about a couple, 3 years ago, we did a demographic profile of Hillsborough County in the year 2015, and we took a look at it. And as far as age structure, the main thing that's going to be dominating the economy in 2015 is going to be us. We're going to be retiring, and our children are going to be trying to find a job and going out and work, and hopefully supporting us like we support our parents. But if we can maintain a clean environment and the place where people want to come retire to, then we'll be doing fine. But one of the major changes is going to be the increase in the Asian American population, nationwide, but also here in Hillsborough County over the next 15 to 20 years. Increased upheavals in some of these areas and financial problems create a push for migration. And it's going to be a natural thing that we should probably be more ready to receive than we are now. But if you look at the streams of migrants internationally that are becoming the area in the future, the Asian Americans are up there in those categories.
Now, where do you see Hillsborough County going? We talked about people moving here, but what kinds of people, what kind of jobs do you see being created in the future here? What kind of community will it be?
We've had a lot of success recently with back office financial operations where it's very labor intensive, where there's a lot of companies that keep track of financial records for various corporations across the country. What's interesting is that it's going to be fun to see if that trend can continue, because one reason why those industries came down here, in addition to the skilled labor pool that we have, is the fact that we have still a comparatively moderate wage rates. They aren't what they are in the areas where these companies are coming from. But what you're going to see, I think, over time, as more of these companies start coming in here and labor pressures start to increase and wages start going up, is those back office financial operations are going to start looking for other places that perhaps wages are more compatible with what they have to offer. But the traditional things that we've been good at in the past, which is the port, the airport, and agriculture, will remain strong components of the economy. You would hope that we can add more of a manufacturing base than we currently have, and that's something that various economic development groups in the area are working on. But as long as we can maintain a good quality of life, we're a natural to attract at least our share of industry to the area.
One thing I wanted to kind of touch upon before we close is I know we have a large university here, second largest in the state. What impact does that have on our future and the type of people that come here?
Oh, it's tremendous, because as far as continuing education and education for people's children when they come here is very important. I think what's interesting too is a lot of the outreach efforts that USF is currently doing, especially to help existing businesses, I think will pay off in the long run. But it's a great tool that I think can help fuel the economy in the future. So
that can make our area more attractive for people to come.
Even more attractive than we already are. Yes,
Great.
sir.
Well, that's good to hear. I'd like to thank today's guest for talking with us about issues that we will face in the future of the U.S. Census. Next month, we'll talk about new trends in environmental planning, another issue we'll face beyond today. Let us know if you have comments about today's show. You can reach us on our hotline or on email as listed here. I'm Ray Charmonti, and on behalf of the Planning Commission, I thank you for thinking beyond today.